If you're a North Korean news aficionado like me, you probably came across the NK News website well before discovering the podcast. It's an incredible source that gets you behind the headlines to give you what's probably the most reliable and evidence-based news on North Korea. Every business day, you'll get between 5 to 10 articles that provide exclusive news, detailed analysis, and informed opinions. And guess what? Each week they send you forward-looking week-ahead briefings and news alerts to keep you ahead of the curve. There's more. NK News members also get special reader-only benefits, access to exclusive events and online conferences, and perpetual access to our archive of podcasts. And here's the best part, you can get a $100 discount on your annual subscription with the code PODCAST. Redeem this podcast-only special today by visiting nknews.org/discount. That's nknews.org/discount. Hello listeners and welcome to the NK News podcast, and today I'm recording a short pre-feature interview featurette with Shreyas Reddy, who is here in the studio with me. Today, of course, it is Tuesday, the 4th of July. Oh, it's the day that England lost a colony back in the 1770s.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say Happy Independence Day, but I'm from India. We've got a different one.
Yeah, you do have a different one, right? So today, let's talk about what's been keeping you interested, or what's grabbed your interest about North Korea in the last week?
Well, there are a few things that have gone on, and on the inter-Korean front, there has been one particularly big move, which is the nomination of a new unification minister in South Korea, Kim Yong-ho. He's a professor of political science and diplomacy, but he has a history of making some controversial statements when it comes to North Korea. So his nomination could still face some hurdles.
Now, I have to confess that I didn't even notice that the term of the last unification minister had ended or had been announced to be ending in the near future.
Yeah, so there had been some speculation for a while that Kwon Young-se, he's still unification minister for now, that he would return to active politics ahead of next year's parliamentary elections. So before he became unification minister, he was a 4-term lawmaker with the main Conservative Party, and now it looks like he's already there. In fact, if you go to Yongsan in Seoul, his old district, you'll already find posters with his face on them at this point.
So Korea, like in America, but unlike in Australia, if you're serving in a government position, you cannot be an elected member of parliament. You're either one or the other, and so when you leave one, you can choose the other.
Yeah, exactly. So with an eye on next year's election in mind, it seems that he is transitioning back into regular politics, and President Yoon Suk-yeol is nominating a different candidate to take his place.
So what makes Kim Yong-ho different from Kwon Young-se?
Well, I think one particularly big change has been in their attitude to the ministry that Kim Yong-ho will now head. So Kim Yong-ho has in the past advocated that the unification ministry be done away with, be folded into the foreign ministry, so treated as a separate thing in itself, not so much focused on the North Korea matters as a separate ministry.
That would be to treat North Korea as another country.
Effectively, yes. And Kwon Young-se, when he quite notably was someone who right from the start, even before his nomination, he was against the abolition of the unification ministry. So at the time he was nominated, it seemed like it was very much a step in favor of keeping that, despite some reports that President Yoon was not in favor of having such a ministry.
It'd be pretty unusual, though, for Kim Yong-ho to go into a ministry that he wants to disband, wouldn't it? I mean, that would be effectively making his own job redundant.
Well, so you'd think, but certainly it does seem like there are changes in the offing for the way the unification ministry works.
Structural changes.
Well, I think that's something that we'll have to see, but at the very least, in terms of the function, in terms of the role, it will be more complicated to make changes than perhaps it would appear, because at the end of the day, it is still a full-fledged ministry. You can't just overhaul its structure altogether. But the comments coming out of Kim as well as President Yoon so far suggest that they have a slightly different focus. President Yoon has suggested that it should be, effectively, he said he's criticized the unification ministry for acting like a North Korea aid ministry in recent years, and says now the focus should be more on putting pressure on North Korea on human rights issues rather than helping support initiatives in North Korea and fostering that kind of diplomacy, while Kim Yong-ho has also, following his nomination, said that his focus is to look into the North Korean human rights angle.
But that brings up the whole question of who is it that gets to talk to North Korea. Now, the Unification Ministry hasn't always been a ministry. It used to be a lower level, I forget whether it was a department or whatever,
yes.
But it became a ministry. I can't remember what year that was, but it became a ministry at some time more than 20 years ago. And it's always been the formal interlocutor with North Korea's, whatever it's called, the United People's Front or the Committee for Fatherland Unification. Gosh,
so the Unification Front Department and the Communication for the Peaceful Reunification of the Fatherland or country, however you translate it.
Right.
Those are two of the main North Korean bodies when it comes to dealing with South Korea. And the Unification Ministry has often dealt directly with them, or at least been their equivalent rather.
Right. Well, now, but coming to jump in there, to the point of equivalency, as I said before, that the Unification Ministry is a fully fledged ministry now with a minister. If it were to be folded into the Foreign Ministry, then it would simply be another department again.
Yes.
Now, already in terms of equivalency and levels, we have a problem because North Korea says that its Committee for Peaceful Unification, it's not even a ministry, it's actually above cabinet level. So when it's meeting with the Unification Ministry, it says this is not the appropriate level. This is not equivalent to us. We're above cabinet level. We're directly responsible to the first chairman of the Korean Workers' Party. So even having us meet a minister is inappropriate. So that would be all the more so. It would be worse if they were meeting with just simply a department head inside the Foreign Ministry.
Certainly, I think from both sides, the definitions and levels often seem to vary depending on who's in charge and who's around them as well. I mean, even North Korea, where you'd think the leadership is quite steady, certainly how they approach these matters might change at different phases depending on who's got greater influence.
Yeah.
But certainly at this point, folding the Unification Ministry into the Foreign Ministry seems perhaps a little unlikely. In fact, even Kim Yong-ho's suggestion, it's not a recent one. It's from before the time Lee Myung-bak became president in 2007. So he's a fairly prominent new right thinker in Korea, and at that time he proposed this solution, one that even made it into Lee Myung-bak's agenda before he actually became president, so like the presidential transition plans. But once they were actually in power, they realized this isn't going to work out. There's going to be too much opposition, too many complications. And that is why the Unification Ministry remained a separate ministry. At the moment, it doesn't seem like they're planning to fold this into the ministry, but certainly there will be concerns about the role it will play, whether it will be as significant in managing inter-Korean relations as it used to, given both Kim's statements and President Yoon's statements.
Coming back to Kim Yong-ho being a new right, my understanding of new right in Korea, as opposed to the old right, is that many new rightists were once Jusapa people back in the 1980s, were friendly to North Korea, sometimes loyal to North Korea, and then did a switch. Ha Tae-kyung's a good example of that, Kim Yong-hwan, I think, as well. Is Kim Yong-ho, the minister designate, also a former Jusapa member?
Kim Yong-ho is in fact a very good example of that, in that he was arrested in 1987 during the pro-democracy protests. He was at the time left-wing academic, and certainly that seems to have been how he initially started making his mark. But at some point, I think South Korean media say that when he traveled to the U.S. and started studying the Korean War in different kind of from different perspective, at that point his views shifted drastically to the right, to the extent that in the last few years he has even written articles and posted videos on his YouTube channel calling for, talking about relations between the Koreas being hostile and even calling for regime change in North Korea.
Yeah, so is he still calling for that? Is he a collapsist?
Certainly he doesn't seem to be doing at the moment. And I think he said that during the tenure of the previous president, Moon Jae-in, when Moon Jae-in was attempting to increase diplomacy with North Korea. At the moment, between his nomination and the fact that it's a different administration, he doesn't seem to be quite as focused on making those kinds of statements, and even appears to have deleted or at least hidden his YouTube channel.
Oh, wow. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding of a person becoming a minister in South Korea is they're nominated by the president. There's some kind of questioning at the National Assembly, but the National Assembly has no power to block it.
Yes, so essentially...
It's not like in America.
No, it's not like... I think here, certainly there will be questions raised, and the National Assembly at the moment, there are still more members of the opposition party, main opposition party in the Assembly, but for all their opposition, no matter how much they grill him, even if they object to his nomination, and they probably will, at the end of the day, if the president wants to appoint him, he can still do so.
Wow, I think it's going to be a very fiery grilling, so let's keep an eye on that in the coming weeks. Now, the other thing that I think we want to talk about today is propaganda in North Korea. Listeners will know that's a favorite topic of mine. What's going on there?
Well, a few things, certainly. One was quite prominent at, one of the more traditional forms was quite prominent at an event on June 25th, the anniversary of the start of the Korean War, which North Korea portrays as South Korea invading the North.
Right. Which is, it's amazing, isn't it, that South Korea invaded North Korea, and yet North Korea was able to turn that around in less than 24 hours and then take Seoul in 3 days. I mean, that's probably one of the world's worst invasions or quickest turnarounds.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting narrative.
Yeah.
But yeah, so as they have in the past, they held mass rallies to voice their protest, and given the current state of relations with the U.S. and South Korea, understandably, the rhetoric was a little hostile, and at one of the mass rallies, they unveiled new North Korean posters depicting a nuclear attack on the U.S. and just general criticism of the vile puppet South Koreans, as they refer to South Korea, particularly when there's a conservative government in charge.
Right, and they had a lot of words like kill and wipe out and eradicate and things like that in the banners, and 120,000 people together in the May Day Stadium.
Yeah.
So it was quite a big deal. They hadn't done that at such a large scale for a while. Yeah,
and they've certainly gone all out to, in some ways, even showed the Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile, which they first tested last year and continue to test, and put that on a poster saying, "Pulverize the American empire into dust." So this appears to be the first example of one of these posters showing a nuclear strike on the US using the Hwasong-17 specifically, although they've certainly had other posters in the past and also present visible at this rally showing a possible attack on the US.
I saw some of the photographs, a lot of raised fists, which is, of course, a common trope at both South and North Korean protests, that if you're angry, you stand there with your fist clenched in the air. And it reminds me a little bit of George Orwell's 2 Minutes of Hate from 1984. When they're organized to express all their, vent all their frustrations and hatred towards the evil puppet South Koreans and their imperialist backers, the Americans.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, over on YouTube, Google has shut down some North Korean propaganda YouTube channels, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. And it's been, these channels have been an increasingly prominent part of North Korea's external outreach in the last few years. They've essentially trying to show what at least they attempt to present as average North Koreans in Pyongyang.
Right. Just out there having a good time, enjoying life.
Exactly. Like, this is daily life in North Korea, presenting a face that suggests it's a very normal country, very normal city. Everything is just fine. But inevitably, of course, this is very much state-driven material, and the people in the videos are hardly average North Koreans. They're very much from elite Pyongyang families, often with close ties to the ruling regime.
Yeah, and we should point out that this, our output at NK News and the podcast especially, it's all in English, but a lot of this propaganda is not aimed at the English-speaking market. It's actually much more aimed at the Chinese-speaking market, isn't it?
Well, this one, there are variations. So they've got some perhaps that tend to be aimed more at China, but in this case, the channels that were deleted were essentially from English-speaking presenters, and they've gained a lot of attention in recent years. The two of these channels in particular, one featured a young girl whose channel debuted last year, and at that time she was described as being 11 years old. Yes.
Kim Song-a, yeah.
Song-a, also known as Sally Parks.
Right.
And
the
so,
Harry Potter fan.
Exactly. Speaks in a posh British accent, talks about her love of Harry Potter, showcases scenes of school life.
Took us to the water park.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So clearly, and she certainly made a fair bit of impact in terms of North Korea's propaganda approach.
Right. That was very specifically an English-focused one. Yeah, I guess, I mean, while these channels attracted some hits and got some views there, I think they pale in comparison to the number of Chinese people looking at the Weibo channels. And Weibo, of course, isn't shutting down any of those channels. It's really only Google shutting down stuff on YouTube, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think essentially when YouTube shut this down, Google said in a statement to the media that they basically looked at this as a sanctions and trade restrictions violation in terms from the US perspective, but they didn't specify how it violates these sanctions. Yeah.
It sounds very vague. It sounds like it might have been at the request of the South Korean government, right? We know that the South Korean government, I mean, full confession, I've subscribed to some of those now cancelled channels on YouTube, and when I'm in South Korea and I don't use a VPN, I can't even look at those channels because those channels, even when they existed, were sometimes blocked to people in South Korea, and I'm sure that's at the request of the Republic of Korea government.
Yeah. So
maybe the banning of the channels themselves may be the same.
Well, the three channels in this case, so Song-a, another one called Yumi Tour series, and another that was called New DPRK. So the three of them were actually blocked in South Korea, specifically a week before the eventual takedown.
That's a sign.
So certainly you've got to wonder if there's some concern there. The fact that YouTube or the Google cited US restrictions makes you wonder if maybe there was an official request from that side as well.
Oh, I see.
But at the moment, we can't be certain. What we do know is that these channels, like Song-a, like Yumi, who often interviewed people in Pyongyang, even though they were very much propaganda and obviously they were heavily scripted, they perhaps did have their own little value to offer for the outside world, for those who are looking to research North Korea, because especially during a pandemic, we're not really seeing much of North Korea. Not that we did before that either. And losing these videos essentially means losing a valuable resource for North Korea researchers to look at open source output, see what is actually going on in the country. Obviously, what they actually say is what they show might be scripted, but you can still read between the lines. You can still make observations about what is going on.
Yeah.
So
I agree with you. I got a quote here from our good friend Peter Ward back in 2019 when the similar wave of cancellations happened. He said then, and I fully agree with him, I understand that YouTube may have compliance concerns, but North Korean media should be freely accessible to all who wish to watch it. I mean, it has an information value, and it helps us to understand the way that North Korea wants itself to be perceived.
Yeah, and I think there may always be concerns about, what if these channels are misleading? What if they influence people into thinking the wrong things? But frankly, at this point, we are in a heavily digital world. The ones who want to think a certain way will inevitably find their own ways to do that.
Yeah.
And most people are, at this point, at least we would hope, attuned enough to it that they would see these particularly over-the-top propaganda videos as little more than that. There isn't as much subtlety, and sure, it may be more polished than the usual North Korean propaganda campaigns in some ways. But at the end of the day, I don't think the people who are actually following these videos for other reasons or getting exposed to them for the first time, were really being swayed by them.
Yeah. No, I think it reminds me of something I've heard many times before, which is that the South Korean government doesn't trust its own citizens to be able to tell good information from bad information.
Certainly. And I think that also comes down to, again, back to that unification minister topic we were discussing at the start. It's just been a few months since the Unification Ministry proposed allowing access to North Korean newspapers, PDF versions of North Korea's main newspaper at designated locations around the country. Now, we haven't really seen any progress in that.
Yeah.
Will we see any progress in that under the new leadership? I don't know.
You can see it online at the Unification Ministry Materials Reading Room inside the National Library down there in Seocho, but you do have to register for that, and you aren't allowed to print what they call tuksujario, special materials, and that includes Nodong Shinmun and things like that. But you can look at them. Anyway, thanks very much for talking to me today, Shreyas, and stay tuned because after this I have an interview with John Bolton.
Thank you for having me.
Ever wondered what lies beyond the inter-Korean border? NK News brings you an opportunity to explore North Korea from a near distance. From October 8 to 17, 2023, journey with us on the second ever North Korea from a Distance tour, visiting key border locations and observatories looking into North Korea, as well as meeting key figures working on DPRK issues. Spend 2 nights on the East Coast, see the beautiful Kumgang Mountains, scour the beaches near the inter-Korean border, and see Kim Il-sung's old summer house. Visit Yeonpyeong-do, the location of the November 2010 inter-Korean artillery bombardment. Observe North Korean hamlets from close quarters in Ganghwa and delve deep into the heart of Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Every step of the way, you'll be guided by leading NK News and Koryo Tour staff and be joined regularly for multi-day portions of the itinerary by leading experts like Andrei Lankov, Chad O'Carroll, Jongmin Kim, Jack Ozwetsid, and Gergo Vachi of Koryo Tours. As a special offer for our podcast listeners, quote podcast when making your booking for an exclusive 10% discount. Find out more at nknews.org/tour. Once again, that's nknews.org/tour and use the code podcast when booking. Let's journey into the unknown together. For this week's feature interview, I'm joined via Zoom by Ambassador John Bolton, who's in the United States. He was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from August 2005 to December 2006 under then-President George W. Bush, and later served as the National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump from April 2018 to September 2019, following Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who appeared on episode 182 of this series. Ambassador Bolton has written 2 books relevant to today's discussion: Surrender is Not an Option, Defending America at the United Nations, published in 2008, and The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir published in 2020. And you can find Ambassador Bolton on Twitter at AMB John Bolton. Welcome on the show, Ambassador Bolton.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
70 years ago this year, the United Nations Command on one side and North Korea and the Chinese People's Volunteers on the other signed an armistice to put a temporary ceasefire in place that would hopefully lead to a peace treaty. 70 years later, here we are. The armistice has mostly held, with some exceptions. The Korean War did not go back to all-out fighting, but now North Korea has nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. So my question to you is, in your opinion, what's the best way to create a lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think notwithstanding everything that's happened in the 70 years since the armistice, it was American policy then, and at least officially still is American policy, that we want to see the Korean Peninsula united. And I think the difficulties are enormous, there's no doubt about it, but to get true and lasting peace on the peninsula, it's time to end what in 1945 was considered to be a temporary partition. It's an anomaly that Korea has not been reunited. The 2 Germanys have been reunited. Obviously, the circumstances are different, and Koreans and Germans would both love to tell you how different the circumstances are. But the fact is, Korea is, and for a long time historically, has been recognized as a nation state, and this division is artificial. Now, how to get that reunification is the tricky part, but that is the natural end state. What's unnatural is the division of the peninsula, and as long as in the north, you have this continuing and unique hereditary communist dictatorship, there will be threats to peace and security on the peninsula. South Korea doesn't threaten anybody. The threat comes from Pyongyang. And unlike other countries where people talk about regime change, there's no need for regime change here. It's the reunification that we should be looking for. We should engage China on it. I think Japan would be a willing partner. We should focus on this. We just shouldn't assume that because the division has existed for 70 years, it reflects what a natural order would be, and one much more likely to lead to peace.
Does it become an either-or situation where either we have to choose to negotiate with North Korea as it is now, or lead to this end state, which is a unification of the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think the North Korean regime at the moment is probably weaker than it's ever been. We don't really have, from the outside, we don't really have a good picture of North Korea post-COVID. We certainly know that Kim Jong-un continues his development of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. But beyond that, we really don't have a good idea how viable that regime still is. I think it's been engaged in successful propaganda for 70 plus years. And I suspect we're seeing a lot of that. But I think that regime is weak economically and really very fragile politically inside. I mean, the real solution here, if Beijing were willing to engage seriously, is for Beijing basically to announce that it no longer needs a buffer state on the Korean Peninsula, and that either the North Koreans get serious about negotiation or China will cut off its supplies of energy, which amount to about 90% of North Korea's energy needs, cut off food and humanitarian supplies. I don't think North Korea lasts without Chinese support. And it's the Chinese, after all, who for decades have said they want peace and stability in Northeast Asia, which is why they oppose the North Korean nuclear weapons program. China could bring both the nuclear weapons program and the Kim family dynasty to an end very quickly. And I think since the U.S., if U.S. is trying to avoid military conflict with China for obvious reasons, but if there were military conflict, it would not involve invading China through North Korea. So China's protection, China's security rests with peace and stability in Northeast Asia generally, and the way to get that is reunify Korea.
Is that the direction in which you tried to steer U.S. policy on the Korean Peninsula when you were National Security Advisor?
Well, there wasn't much policy to steer. Certainly, my feeling was that if you can identify the causes of threats and instability, that's a first step to trying to resolve them. And everything comes back to the regime in North Korea, backed by China. I think the U.S. policy for many, many years really assigned China the wrong role. We took China at face value that they were a neutral mediator. They were concerned about the nuclear weapons program, and North Korea was independent. They couldn't make them do what they wanted to do. I just think this is a convenient fiction for China. It served Chinese interests to let us believe it, and we did believe it, and that's been a mistake. This is a solvable problem and would be to the enormous benefit of the people of North Korea and South Korea as well. It would not pose a threat to China. I could envision circumstances, and perhaps as a condition of a global resolution of the Korea issue, where American troops might leave the peninsula to demonstrate we're not a threat to China. We don't want to be on the Yalu River. That's just not a place where American troops need to be. There are plenty of other places where they need to be. It could lead to a negotiated agreement between U.S., Japan, and China on how to resolve the Korean issue. I just, every time I think about it, I come up against the question, why have not people in Washington and in Asia been willing to talk more seriously about reunification, especially in South Korea? It's unnatural that their family members, many of them, their ancestral homes are north of the 38th parallel, and they can't visit them without great risk. So there are a lot of reasons why the obvious answer here makes sense, and there aren't a lot of obvious reasons why people haven't been more diligent in pursuing it.
As you said a moment ago, it's been in China's interest to not go in that direction. How do you convince China that its interests lie elsewhere?
Well, I think right now the U.S. has enormous controversy going on with China across a wide range of things. So I'm not suggesting that if we put the question of Korean reunification on the table, it would resolve itself quickly. But what I think we should confront China with is their responsibility for North Korean behavior. The North Korean nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs wouldn't exist without China, wouldn't exist without the assistance that China has provided for many years, wouldn't exist without, on nuclear and ballistic missiles matters, wouldn't exist but for the economic assistance China has provided, the political cover China has provided, and the fact that having this troublesome buffer state doesn't threaten China, it threatens South Korea, it threatens Japan, it threatens the United States. If China really wants to move, as they say, toward more stability in the world, stability begins at home, right there on the Korean Peninsula. So I would put reunification on the table as a bilateral issue between the United States and China. I don't know that we're about to make any progress on any issue with China, but I think talking about better relations with China without including the case of the rogue state of North Korea just ignores the reality.
But for that to be a bilateral issue between the U.S. and China, that is to cut out or ignore, if you will, the governments of both South Korea and North Korea.
Well, in a sense, I think we've seen this in other contexts. There can be conversations between North and South Korea. There were under Moon Jae-in, although his idea of reunification, I think, was naive. But the fact is, as East Germany began to collapse with the end of the Cold War, a lot of the discussions about the future of a reunited Germany were accomplished by what was then called the Quad, the European version of the Quad, West Germany, France, Britain, and the United States. So it's not to say that bilateral channels between Beijing and Washington would be the only forum on which reunification would be discussed. But I think if the two superpowers could see a path forward, I think it would be a lot easier for everybody else. It would be impossible to have peaceful reunification if Washington and Beijing disagree.
In your 2020 book, you wrote that you were, I think the word was sickened at heart was the phrase, at the eagerness with which President Trump wanted to talk to Chairman Kim of North Korea. Do you think that the United States has finished talking to North Korea, that it should simply focus on shutting out the leadership of Pyongyang?
Look, we've talked to North Korea for 70 years, beginning with the original armistice in 1953. And in one case after another, beginning with the armistice negotiations, North Korea has violated essentially every commitment it has ever made. Particularly in the last 30 plus years on the nuclear side, it has agreed to denuclearize in agreements with South Korea and agreements with the United States and others in clear and explicit terms. At least 4 times. It has never seriously undertaken denuclearization. We have seen zero evidence of a strategic decision by North Korea to give up the pursuit of deliverable nuclear weapons. As I say, we've seen all kinds of commitments to do it. We've seen all kinds of willingness to negotiate in order to get economic concessions from the U.S., Japan, and others, relief from sanctions, economic assistance, you name it. The scope of these negotiations has always been the same. The concessions by South Korea, Japan, and the United States on the economic side are always up front. The hard work by North Korea to denuclearize is always on the back, and the front end gets accomplished, and the back end never does get accomplished. So all of your viewers may not know the story of the Peanuts characters, the cartoon strip with Lucy and Linus in the football, where every fall, Lucy puts the football down for Charlie Brown to kick it, and every year she pulls the football up. North Korea is Lucy, and I don't think we should be Charlie Brown anymore.
But with the current war in the Ukraine, many observers have said, some even on this podcast, that surely now North Korea it was convinced more than ever that it should not ever give up its nuclear weapons.
Well, I don't think this is a question of negotiating with a rational leader in North Korea. I mean, I'm not saying that Kim Jong-un is irrational. I'm just saying, as Vladimir Putin likes to say, he has his logic, we have ours. This is a question of China saying, we're tired of the North Korean nuclear weapons program, and we will have it ceased, or North Korea will cease to have energy. I think that's a pretty persuasive argument.
In a written interview that you conducted in February 2022 with one of my colleagues at NK News, you said that diplomacy has failed. What are your thoughts on President Biden's policy on North Korea as compared to President Trump's?
Well, I don't think President Biden has much of a policy. It looks a lot like strategic patience from the Obama administration. That's a nice sounding phrase. It turns out in dictionary terms, it is synonymous with do nothing. And the North Koreans took advantage of that under Obama. I believe they're taking advantage of it under Biden to continue progress on the nuclear side and on the missile side. You know, time is invariably on the side of the proliferator in matters of weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear matters. Very complicated scientifically and technologically. You can make a lot of mistakes on the way to getting deliverable nuclear weapons. So the more time the proliferator has, the greater the chances of success. And we've now gone through an enormous amount of time. We've seen North Korea test 6 times nuclear devices. You know, for decades, American and other leaders said it is unacceptable for North Korea to get nuclear weapons. Now, I judge the word unacceptable to mean we will not accept it. And yet today, the same people who said we need to negotiate are saying, well, it looks like it's too late. Looks like North Korea has nuclear weapons. I guess we've got to accept it after all. I don't buy that. I think it's not simply the threat North Korea itself poses regionally and potentially in the near future to the United States. It's a global threat. North Korea, being a desperately poor country, will sell nuclear weapons to anybody with hard currency. I'm convinced of it. Their first customer could be the Ayatollahs in Iran, for that matter. But North Korea is a proliferation threat. really does concern the whole world. And I think that's just not something I'm prepared to accept, whether other people are or not.
Going into the history a little bit of the negotiations with North Korea, so to make sure it didn't get a nuclear weapons program. Back in 1994, there was the agreed framework, which was arranged by Bill Clinton's administration, and you were never a fan of it. In your book, Surrender is Not an Option, you wrote that you had been looking for a hammer to shatter that agreed framework. Why were you so opposed to it from the start?
Because I had, one, no faith that North Korea would adhere to it, which they didn't. And the hammer that I found was conclusive proof and ultimately admission by North Korea that it was conducting uranium enrichment activities, plainly in violation of the terms of the agreed framework. And number two, I thought that the odds were that we would provide energy assistance and ultimately, unbelievably, build light water nuclear reactors for North Korea, which they'd simply incorporate into their nuclear weapons program. The whole premise of the agreed framework that light water reactors were not proliferation threats as opposed to heavy water reactors is completely false. You can manipulate fission inside a reactor, whether it uses light water or heavy water, to produce plutonium, which is then reprocessable out of the spent fuel to make into nuclear weapons. So the whole concept to me rewarded bad behavior and, in fact, helped North Korea expand its nuclear capabilities. I mean, what kind of deal is that?
Well, other parties that we make deals with and sometimes disagree with never fully enforce them, and agreements are not always enforced in full, and things can be hidden from us. Why is this a different case?
Because I think nuclear weapons are a different case from almost anything else I can think of. This is not a trade deal, where they're cheating on their subsidies for their exports or that sort of thing. And the risk of failing here, as we have failed, and as we are failing with respect to Iran, is unleashing the nuclear threat, not just from countries like North Korea and Iran, but encouraging other countries in the region themselves to get nuclear weapons. That's how proliferation works. And that's why tamping it down everywhere it seems to break out is so important. And I think this is largely the responsibility of the United States, and I am very dismayed that we failed in both cases of Iran and North Korea, failing in the case of Iran. But nobody else was trying effectively. Nobody else could do it. We tried it and we failed because of this belief that so many people have that, when you sit down across the negotiating table with the Iranians or the North Koreans, they're reasonable people just like you are. They're trying to find a solution to a common problem. Winston Churchill, and I quote this in my book, Surrender is Not an Option, once described that kind of mentality as the confirmed unteachability of mankind. These authoritarian terrorist regimes will say anything and then ignore their own commitments, while we naive Americans and Westerners say, well, we've signed a solemn international agreement and we comply with it because that's what we do when we sign and ratify treaties. We comply with treaties. Countries like North Korea and Iran do not. And time again, they do this to us. Time and time again, we fail to learn the lesson.
In your view, what went wrong in the second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim in Hanoi in February 2019?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un came into that meeting in Hanoi believing that he could work the same horse trade that his predecessors had done, or at least his father had done several times with prior administrations, that he would commit to give up nuclear weapons and in exchange would receive tangible economic benefits. And I had no doubt in my mind he would happily accept the tangible economic benefits and then not follow through on his commitments to denuclearize. He had already tried a number of Potemkin Village things over the years, he and his father, the destruction of the cooling tower at Yongbyon, for example, which didn't affect the reactor at Yongbyon. It just meant you'd discharge a lot of hot water into the stream and kill a lot of fish and vegetation. The so-called closure of the test tunnels in the mountainous region where their earlier nuclear tests had been conducted, as if closing down the opening of a mine shaft closes the entire tunnel. It was all entirely predictable what Kim would do, and we put to them, for example, a basic arms control prerequisite. When you talk arms control, you start with baseline declarations of what your assets are. This is how we've negotiated with the Soviets and Russia for decades. They wouldn't do a baseline declaration, and they wouldn't move away from the formula of bit by bit by bit, which they would benefit from up front and then never perform down the road. And to Kim's surprise, and frankly, somewhat to my surprise, Trump ultimately wouldn't agree to it, and that was the end of the conversation.
You've been one of the people who strongly advocated a Libya model for North Korean denuclearization. Could you briefly say how you think that would work? What would it look like, and what are the prospects for its success?
Well, I said specifically the Libya model of 2003, 2004, which came about when Muammar Gaddafi realized that we had him dead to rights on his illicit nuclear weapons program. The antecedents to the Proliferation Security Initiative had seized a German-owned ship called the BBC China, an unusual name, but that was the name of the ship, taken it to Italian customs officials, where they found elements for nuclear centrifuges in crates marked used auto parts. This was material he had ordered from the AQCON Proliferation Network, and it was unmistakable evidence of a Libyan nuclear weapons program. So, number one, there wasn't any ambiguity here, and he knew it, and we knew it. Number two, he had just watched the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and he had seen Saddam captured from the famous spider hole. And I think he was worried the same was going to happen to him. So he did nuclear disarmament the right way. He said, I want to get out of the nuclear weapons business. Here's what I have. Send your people in. I'll show you everything you want, and then we'll discuss how to pack it up and take it away. And he wanted that because he thought if he gave up nuclear weapons and proved it, that he would have the ability to resume trade with Europe, the United States, and the rest. And in fact, at least on the nuclear side, I'm not so sure he was honest on the chemical weapons side, but on the nuclear side, we believed in early 2004, we had pretty much found everything. And we shipped it up and sent it to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the Libyan nuclear weapons program now lives.
But it's hard to imagine that same model working in the North Korean situation.
Well, I don't see why not. People say, oh, but, when the Arab Spring came, Gaddafi was overthrown and killed. Well, let me ask this question. In 2003, 2004, when Gaddafi gave up nuclear weapons, did anybody predict the Arab Spring was coming? No, they didn't. If Gaddafi had had nuclear weapons at the time of the Arab Spring, would that have prevented him from being captured, hiding in a drainage pipe, and being killed by his own people? The nuclear weapons program wouldn't have affected that at all. This is the sort of thing where you say it's what the logics professors call the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. After the fact, therefore, because of the fact. Gaddafi didn't fall because he gave up the nuclear weapons program. I think the two were utterly unrelated. If Kim Jong-un wanted real peace and stability, he would realize he would be better off without nuclear weapons. And he obviously has not reached that point yet. And so we don't have any alternative, I think, but for our own safety's sake, to take steps that remove that capability from North Korea or find a new regime.
Do you think that the U.S. should redeploy tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea?
Well, I think it's something we should consider. The relatively new government of President Yoon, many of his supporters have raised that question. It's a subject of debate. I wish in the aftermath of the Cold War that communism really had receded from the rest of the world. It obviously hasn't. Certainly in the case of this museum piece of a regime in North Korea. But it may be that it would help deter Kim Jong-un. People say, well, North Korea only wants nuclear weapons to defend against the United States. That's simply not the case. They believe, it may make sense or it may not make sense, they believe in North Korea they can reunify the Korean Peninsula under their terms. And I think making it clear that's not going to happen while we have anything to say about it is important. And returning a greater sense of deterrence may wake, if not Kim Jong-un up, may wake others in North Korea up, and that would be a plus.
Are there any negative second or third tier effects of having U.S. nuclear assets stationed in South Korea? And if so, how could they be countered or preempted?
Well, I think the historical experience has been when people in the region, in Japan and South Korea in particular, feel threatened, they welcome a more robust presence. And I would also argue that for those in South Korea, in Japan, who today say because of now not just the North Korean nuclear weapons program, but the emerging hegemonic threat of China, that respectively South Korea or Japan need nuclear weapons, my argument would be no, they don't. The U.S. nuclear deterrent remains credible. Our commitment to the defense of South Korea and Japan is represented now not only by our physical presence in both countries, but by the return of the tactical nuclear weapons. So they don't need a separate nuclear umbrella. Our umbrella still works.
You've sometimes been described as being a bit hawkish. If you were President of the United States, under what circumstances could you envisage a preemptive strike on North Korea?
Well, it depends on what you mean by hawkish. I mean, the ancient Romans used to say, si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. Ronald Reagan called it peace through strength. I think that's the ideal way to go. I think deterrence can go a long way toward maintaining stability. It's not an easy course, but if the alternative is making more concessions to an aggressor, it's not going to end well. I want to see the end of nuclear weapons in North Korea. As I said a moment ago, American leaders for decades have said it's unacceptable for North Korea to have nuclear weapons. I actually believe that. And I believe if we're not prepared to accept it, we have to consider what actions to take if all of our other efforts have failed. Because I don't want Chicago or Los Angeles or Boston to be at risk of a regime that is now run by the third hereditary communist dictator. This is not a formula to give peace and security to the region or to the world as a whole.
In 2017, during President Trump's first year in the White House, when you were not yet National Security Advisor, it did seem like there was a moment when some kind of whether it was, we call it a bloody nose strike or a preemptive strike or some sort of kinetic activity, may have taken place to convince North Korea to give up its nukes. Was that something that sounded feasible to you?
Well, I'm not sure that fits as part of a larger strategy. I mean, I think you have to look at all of the potential ramifications down the road. And there's no doubt, because of poor urban planning, that the city of Seoul has grown over the years right up to the DMZ, and that the civilian population near the DMZ, within artillery range of North Korean positions on the other side, is in a very vulnerable position. That's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. I understand that. So when you contemplate the potential of military force against North Korea, you have to be able to answer the entirely understandable South Korean question: how do we protect these people? And I think that means thinking through very carefully how one would eliminate the North Korean capability to cause harm across the DMZ, even before you get to the nuclear weapons. And that's complicated. But, I don't think we had to be at this point, unfortunately. We're not quite at this point with Iran yet. I hope as we're not like what Churchill said and completely unteachable. But the point he was making was, when people are afraid to act at an early time when the risks and costs would be lower, and wait until a later time when all the risks and costs are potentially higher, this is what you get. The truly peaceful solution that avoids war over the nuclear weapons is the reunification of the peninsula.
Next year, of course, is the presidential election in the United States. If a Republican takes the White House again, would you be interested in a position?
Well, it would depend on which Republican and in what regard. But I spent a lot of my career in public service, and I've been honored to do that. And for all of the Republican nominees I can think of, potential nominees I can think of, but one, sure, I'd be honored to serve the country again.
Right now, who has the best policy on North Korea, if anyone has talked to you about it? I know it's not something that is top issue of the discussion right now, but do you have any sense of who has a good policy on it?
Well, I think almost all of the candidates, just based on their prior comments on North Korea, other than Donald Trump, look like they point in the right direction. Certainly, Vice President Pence, who was privileged to work with during the Trump administration, understands the issue very well. I think Ron DeSantis has in the past, during his career in Congress, has said the right things about North Korea, and I think many of the others have as well.
Do you think that Donald Trump would go back to his previous ways?
Yeah, this is Donald Trump as president. What did he like most about the famous first meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore? That after it was over, he held one of the largest press conferences he had ever given. That's what it's about with Trump. He doesn't understand the issues under negotiation. He doesn't understand the significance of the play that Kim Jong-un is making. And I would be very worried that if there were a second Trump term, Kim Jong-un would out-negotiate him as he came close to doing before.
Well, we understand you have a hard stop now, so I want to thank you very much for coming on the NK News podcast today, Ambassador Bolton. Listeners can find your thoughts on Twitter at AMB John Bolton. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.
Not at all. My pleasure. Let me ask you this. You're listening to the NK News podcast, so you know more about North Korea than most. But how about the South? To really understand what's happening on the peninsula, you need to know about South Korea. And now you can, through our new Korea Pro news and analysis service. This is not your average news service. It's a thoroughly researched analysis of South Korea's politics, society, and economy from an international perspective. But you know what the cherry on top is? The absolute lack of commercial influences. No ads, no sponsored articles. It's just pure, objective analysis by a team of qualified specialists. And the best part? As a listener of this podcast, you get a 25% discount. All you have to do is use the coupon code PODCAST during your sign-up. So head over to koreapro.org/podcast and start your journey with Korea Pro. That's koreapro.org/podcast. Our thanks as always to Brian Betts and Arius Dare for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and puts in the ads. Thank you very much for listening, and next time.